In the early days of its combat debut, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was something of an underdog. When German pilots first encountered this new American fighter in 1943, some reportedly scoffed at the sight. It was enormous, nearly the size of a twin-engine light bomber, and its rotund fuselage earned it the unflattering nickname Jug, short for Juggernaut, or perhaps simply likening its profile to a stout milk jug. Allied airmen who had grown up on lean, elegant Spitfires and Mustangs weren't immediately impressed by the portly Thunderbolt either. How could this 7-ton beast dogfight with the nimble German Bf-109s or the agile Japanese Zero? American pilots in the Pacific preferred the lighter P-38 Lightning and dismissed the P-47 as too heavy and unmaneuverable for close-in dogfights. Early Thunderbolt crews heard the snickers and felt the sting of skepticism. Many wondered if this new fighter, with its bulk, its big radial engine, and a nose ringed by 8.50 caliber machine guns, would prove a thunderbolt or just a dud. Little did they know, the Jug was about to earn a legendary reputation. Those first months in combat were indeed a trial by fire for the P-47. The Thunderbolt's R2800 double Wasp engine, paired with a state-of-the-art turbo supercharger, gave it excellent high-altitude performance, but at lower altitudes, the P-47 could feel sluggish. It was slow in a climb and lazy off the mark, as pilots complained. In aerial duels over Europe, Luftwaffe tacticians quickly learned how to exploit the Jug's weight. The P-47 was too heavy for some maneuvers. One German pilot recalled, "We would see it coming from behind and pull up fast, and the P-47 couldn't follow. Then we came around and got on its tail." Indeed, in a steep climb, the lighter German fighters could out-zoom the Thunderbolt and turn the tables. American Thunderbolt pilots had to be careful. If they tried to turn tightly or climb after a foe, they might suddenly find the agile Messerschmitts looping behind them. U.S. ace Don Blakesley, who would later fly P-51s, joked that the Thunderbolt ought to be able to dive. It certainly can't climb. In those early encounters, the Jug could feel like a clumsy prize fighter swinging at quicker opponents and hitting only air. Yet even as the Thunderbolt's critics chattered, its strengths were revealing themselves. It was fantastically fast in a dive and could absorb an incredible amount of punishment, noted one historian, neatly summing up the P-47's defining traits. This juggernaut could dive like an anvil dropped from the heavens, and once in a dive, few enemy planes could match its breakneck speed. German pilots learned the hard way not to follow a Thunderbolt in a steep dive. More than one Bf-109 or Fu-190 went down in pieces after its airframe tore apart, trying to keep up with the plummeting Jug. And if the P-47 had a truck-like feel in the air, it also had a truck's rugged durability. It was so large and well-armored that pilots joked they could almost unstrap their seatbelts and run around inside the cockpit to dodge enemy bullets. That was a humorous exaggeration, of course, but it spoke to a real advantage. The Thunderbolt was built to take a beating. With its air-cooled radial engine up front, it had no fragile liquid cooling system to be punctured. Many pilots would later recount amazement at how much damage their Jug sustained, yet kept flying. Stories of planes limping home with cylinders shot out of the engine or big holes in the wings were not uncommon. And crucially, the P-47 was ferociously well armed. Its 8 wing-mounted .50 caliber Browning machine guns gave it more firepower than any single-engine fighter in the world. Together they could spit out over 12 pounds of lead every second, enough to literally saw an enemy aircraft in half in a single sustained burst. So while one moment a German might be laughing at the flying Jug, the next he could find himself staring in horror as that Jug dove in behind him with 8 gun barrels flashing. The laughter wouldn't last long. Nothing drove home the Thunderbolt's toughness more dramatically than the experience of Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson on June 26, 1943. Johnson was a rookie in the famed 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, flying one of the group's first P-47C Thunderbolts on bomber escort duty over France. That day, his formation of 48 Jugs was bounced by a swarm of battle-hardened Focke-Wulf FW-190s. In a blur of tracer fire and cannon blasts, Johnson's P-47 took catastrophic hits. 20-millimeter shells exploded against his aircraft. One round blew out part of his canopy and drenched him in hydraulic fluid. Shrapnel peppered his face and a bullet creased his nose, half blinding him with blood. As his Thunderbolt rolled over into a diving spiral, Johnson realized he was in serious trouble. He tried to bail out of the mortally wounded plane, but the canopy mechanism had been damaged and jammed shut, trapping him in the cockpit. Plunging toward the French countryside, he fought the controls with all his strength. Miraculously, the overweight Jug responded just enough. The dive slowed, and Johnson managed to level off at low altitude. The burning, battered P-47 was still in the fight, just barely. Before Johnson could recover or find his bearings, an FW-190 zoomed up behind him. The German pilot had seen Johnson's stricken plane falling out of the sky and now closed in for the kill. Inside the P-47's cockpit, Johnson was dazed, wounded, and nearly blind, but he refused to give up. He jinked his heavy plane as best he could, anticipating the Germans' attacks. The Luftwaffe ace made a firing pass, blasting the Thunderbolt with cannon shells that tore even more holes in its airframe. Incredibly, Johnson's Jug soaked up the damage and kept flying straight. Perhaps intrigued by the Americans' refusal to go down, the German pulled alongside the P-47's wing. Through the fog of blood and oil on his windscreen, Johnson saw the FW-190's canopy draw level with his. The enemy pilot looked him in the eye and raised his hand in a jaunty salute. For a heartbeat, Johnson thought the German might be showing mercy, sparing a helpless opponent. But it was a cruel tease. The FW-190 slid back behind the Thunderbolt and opened fire again, hammering the Jug with bullets from nose to tail. The German was determined to finish off this stubborn American once and for all. Bullet after bullet slammed into Johnson's aircraft. By now, virtually every system in the P-47 was failing, except, critically, that big radial engine which kept pounding away. Johnson's rugged Thunderbolt simply would not die. The duel had become a macabre test of endurance between German firepower and American engineering. The FW-190 pilot expended all his ammunition making multiple passes at the weaving P-47 to no avail. Finally, incredulous that the Jug was still airborne, the German pulled alongside one last time. He gave the shattered Thunderbolt and its bloodied pilot a final salute, this one perhaps out of genuine respect, then rolled his wings and disappeared toward home, his guns empty. Against all odds, Robert Johnson was still alive. Somehow, The young lieutenant coaxed his shot-up P-47 back across the English Channel. With no hydraulics and limited control, he managed to crash land at his base in England. When ground crews rushed to pull him from the cockpit, they were aghast at what they saw. The Thunderbolt was riddled with holes, cannon gashes, bullet punctures, shrapnel gouges everywhere. Johnson himself counted over 200 holes before he stopped tallying. Yet neither German cannons nor the forces of gravity had been able to knock the Jug out of the sky. Johnson's survival was nothing short of a miracle, but it was also a testament to the P-47's legendary toughness. Stories like this soon spread through Allied circles. The P-47 Thunderbolt might have been born an underdog, but after June 1943, no one dared call it a pushover. As one pilot quipped, "If you wanted to shoot down a Thunderbolt, you'd better bring an entire squadron's worth of ammunition. The Jug could take it, and then bring its pilot safely home." By late 1943 and into 1944, the Thunderbolt was coming into its own. Pilots learned to play to the P-47's strengths and avoid exposing its weaknesses. The preferred tactic became boom and zoom, dive from a high altitude with the element of surprise. Unleash the Thunderbolt's overwhelming firepower in one pass, then use its momentum to climb back up out of reach. Dogfighting at low altitudes or trying to turn tightly with enemy fighters was strongly discouraged. Leaders like Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, drilled these doctrines into their squadrons, and the Thunderbolt itself was improved to better meet the challenges. In early 1944, P-47's Ds began to be fitted with new Hamilton Standard paddle blade propellers, wide, paddle-shaped propeller blades that grabbed more air and significantly improved the Jug's climb rate. Around the same time, engines were upgraded with water injection systems that could temporarily boost power output by as much as a third for emergency bursts of speed. At last, the Jug could hold its own in a climb, going from miserable to acceptable in ascent, as pilots wryly noted. These changes meant that the old German trick of zooming away from a P-47 was no longer foolproof. The Thunderbolt was becoming more formidable by the month. On the other side of the world, in the skies of the Southwest Pacific, the P-47 was also dispelling doubts. When the 348th Fighter Group arrived in New Guinea in mid-1943, equipped with brand new Thunderbolts, many veterans in the Pacific Theater thought it was a mistake. They looked at the Jug, huge and heavy, and then at the lightweight Japanese Zero, famed for its acrobatic dogfighting, and shook their heads. Some pilots outright preferred to fly P-38 Lightnings rather than the chunky new P-47. But the 348th's commander, Colonel Neel E. Kearby, saw potential where others saw problems. Kearby quickly became a true believer in the Thunderbolt's strengths. He recognized that if used correctly, utilizing its speed in a dive, its firepower, and its ability to survive damage, the P-47 could outmatch even the nimblest enemy. He aggressively schooled his pilots in energy tactics, hit hard from above, and don't get into turning contests. The results spoke for themselves. On October 11th, 1943, Kearby led a flight of 4 Thunderbolts on a fighter sweep over Wewak, New Guinea. Spying a mixed formation of Japanese aircraft below, fighters and bombers, Kearby seized the moment. He screamed downward in a near vertical dive, his Jug shuddering as it passed 15,000 feet and picked up tremendous speed. In a brief, ferocious engagement, Kearby and his wingmen sprang upon the enemy formation like falcons. The colonel himself shot down 6 Japanese planes in under 15 minutes, an astonishing single-mission tally that left even seasoned combat pilots in awe. One after another, enemy aircraft fell in flames to the Thunderbolt's guns. When Kearby returned to base, his crew painted 6 rising sun insignias on the side of his P-47 to mark the kills. For this extraordinary exploit, Neel Kearby was awarded the Medal of Honor by General Douglas MacArthur. The skeptics in the Pacific had been silenced. Clearly, the Jug could brawl with the best of them, so long as the fight was on the P-47's terms. Kearby went on to rack up a total of 22 aerial victories, becoming one of the top American aces in the Pacific. He proved that the Thunderbolt's heft was no handicap at all. It was a weapon, to be wielded with clever tactics and fearless leadership. Tragically, Kearby would not survive the Mon. In March 1944, he was shot down and killed after an aggressive maneuver at low altitude, a sober reminder that even the mighty Jug could not grant invincibility. But his legacy lived on in the confidence he gave to his men and the renown he brought to the Thunderbolt's name. Back in Europe, the Thunderbolt was also carving out a record of dominance. By the spring of 1944, American P-47 groups were ranging deeper into Axis territory, steadily gaining the upper hand over the Luftwaffe. The introduction of drop tanks, auxiliary fuel tanks that could be carried under the wings or belly, gradually extended the P-47's range, allowing Thunderbolts to escort heavy bombers on longer missions. The once daunting problem of limited fuel began to ease. Paper drop tanks carrying an extra 108 gallons could be slung under the wings, giving the Jug the legs to roam far from its bases in England. German pilots who had counted on U.S. fighters turning back early were in for nasty surprises. On March 6, 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces launched a bold daylight raid on Berlin, the heart of Hitler's Reich. Dozens of P-47 Thunderbolts, along with the new P-51 Mustangs, escorted the B-17 and B-24 bombers all the way to the target and back. In brutal air battles high over Germany, the Thunderbolts showed the Luftwaffe how far they had come. Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group alone claimed 30 German fighters shot down in the skies near Berlin that day. When the Jugs finally landed back in England, their pilots were greeted as heroes who had helped write a turning point in the air war. The mission proved the Thunderbolt could strike at the enemy's capital itself, something unimaginable a year earlier. By the summer of 1944, the Jug and its pilots were a dominant force in the skies of Western Europe, engaging and wearing down the once formidable Luftwaffe. The Thunderbolt was also becoming beloved by those who flew it, as newer fighters like the long-range P-51 Mustang arrived in greater numbers. Some units traded in their Jugs for the sleeker planes, but many P-47 pilots were reluctant to give up the trusty brute that had seen them through so much. In fact, one elite outfit, the 56th Fighter Group, flatly refused to switch. They had started the war with Thunderbolts and, by choice, ended the war with them. The only fighter group in the 8th Air Force to stick with the P-47 right to VE Day. That's how much those pilots loved their JUGS. Major Francis Gabby Gabreski of the 56th was one such die-hard Thunderbolt man. By mid-1944, Gabreski had become the leading American ace in Europe, with 28 aerial victories, all scored in P-47s. He would forever be remembered grinning from the cockpit of his Jug HVA with 28 little swastika kill markers painted under the canopy rail. Gabreski was even scheduled to rotate home in July 1944, but he couldn't resist one more mission, and on that sortie, he crash-landed behind enemy lines and was taken prisoner. The old Jug had saved his life in the crash. He emerged unscathed, and his war was over. But his 28 victories remain the highest tally of any U.S. fighter pilot in the European theater. Not far behind was his fellow P-47 ace, Robert S. Johnson. Yes, the same Johnson who survived that harrowing June 43 ordeal. Johnson went on to score 27 victories in his Thunderbolt, making him one of America's top aces and notably the first USAAF pilot in Europe to break the World War I record of Eddie Rickenbacker. These men, and many like them, trusted the P-47 with their lives and preferred it even when flashier options came along. As one contemporary put it, the P-51 might be prettier to look at, but the P-47 was the one you wanted with you in a real fight. The Thunderbolt was like a faithful bulldog, not the sleekest or fastest, but utterly reliable and fiercely protective of its master. By the time D-Day arrived, June 6, 1944, the P-47 had helped achieve something invaluable. A largely cleared sky with Allied air superiority all but secured over Normandy, the Thunderbolts turned their attention fully to ground attack, a role for which they were supremely suited. On D-Day itself, and the brutal weeks that followed, P-47s roared in at low level to support the embattled troops trying to break out from the beachheads. An infantryman pinned down by German fire might have heard a low thunder building, then looked up to see a Jug streaking in, guns blazing and bombs screaming down. One pilot noted that the sight of a P-47, or the RAF's similar Typhoon, blasting the enemy was a massive morale boost to Allied soldiers under fire. Time and again, a pair of Thunderbolts would show up just when things looked desperate, dropping ordnance with terrifying precision on German strongpoints and scattering enemy counterattacks. The GIs on the ground loved the Jug. They painted Thunderbolt logos on their helmets. They cheered and waved when the big fighters passed overhead, and they knew that as long as those flying tanks were on station, they had guardian angels watching over them. The Germans on the ground, meanwhile, learned to fear and hate the P-47. The Thunderbolt's 8 guns were just as lethal against targets on the earth as in the sky. A strafing pass from a Jug could shred trucks, locomotives, and infantry with equal ease. And unlike delicate dive bombers of earlier years, the P-47 could also carry a heavy bomb load. Typically, it hauled a pair of 500-pound bombs or a cluster of deadly 5-inch rockets, in addition to external fuel tanks. Thunderbolts ranged across France and the Low Countries after D-Day, loitering over roads and rail lines to smash anything that moved. Trains were blown to twisted scrap, tanks and armored vehicles left burning by the dozens, their crews shocked by how quickly a few jabos, German slang for fighter bombers, could inflict carnage. In one famous instance, P-47 pilots caught a German armored division's convoy on a French country road and tore it apart from end to end, paving the way for Allied troops to advance. The work was grueling and dangerous. Jugs often came back peppered with flak holes, or sometimes didn't come back at all. Flying in at low altitude meant flying into the teeth of every machine gun and cannon the Germans could bring to bear. Yet here, too, the Thunderbolt's renowned toughness proved vital. Pilots credited the P-47 with saving their lives on many occasions when ground fire that would have downed a lesser plane merely left the Jug scarred but still flying. As one 9th Air Force Thunderbolt pilot remarked, it was the only aircraft that could carry out those low-level missions when a lot of metal was flying around. Anything lighter would just not make it back. The Thunderbolt's heavy armor, powerful engine, and sheer size made it uniquely survivable in the hazardous close-air support mission. Throughout the Battle of Normandy, the drive across France, and into the Low Countries, P-47s remained a constant, thundering presence overhead. They escorted bombers by day, and then dive-bombed bridges and rail yards by evening. They strafed enemy positions right in front of Allied lines, often coordinating via radio with forward observers or even tank crews on the ground. By December 1944, when Germany launched its final counteroffensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, the Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force were battle-seasoned veterans of the tactical air war. During the first week of that battle, bad weather grounded most aircraft, and German forces surged forward. But when clear skies returned just after Christmas, the Jugs went to work with a vengeance. They prowled over the Ardennes, pouncing on German columns that thought they had evaded notice. P-47s, unloaded bombs onto tanks jammed on narrow forest roads, and raked convoys with machine gun fire, leaving wreckage and flames in their wake. American soldiers encircled at places like Bastogne took heart as they saw waves of Thunderbolts swooping in to deliver relief from above. In those bitter cold days, the Jugs helped turn the tide, chopping up the enemy's spearheads and smashing their supplies. A German officer captured during the Bulge bitterly remarked that the constant jabot attacks had made every daylight movement suicidal. If the American fighter bombers saw you, you were finished, he said. One striking incident during that period illustrated not only the Jug's impact, but also the overwhelming might of American industry behind it. On New Year's Day, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched a surprise low-level attack, Operation Bodenplatte, against Allied airfields in Europe. At one airbase in Metz, France, caught unawares in the early morning, German fighters strafed and destroyed over 20 P-47s on the ground, setting the flight line ablaze. Among the captured German pilots brought in that day was one particularly cocky individual. Gesturing at the burning Thunderbolts, the German smirked to his American captors and asked, "Well, what do you think of that?" It seemed a grievous blow. Dozens of precious fighters gone up in smoke in minutes. But the Americans simply shrugged. In a matter of days, new replacement P-47s arrived from rear depots and were lined up on the same field, fresh and gleaming, as if nothing had happened. The base was quickly back to full strength. When Major George Brooking, one of the unit commanders, later showed the same German prisoner the flight line now bristling with brand new Thunderbolts, the prisoner's smug grin faded. With a quiet, defeated voice, he muttered, That is what is beating us. The sight of those replacement Jugs, the corpulent, unmistakable shape of the very fighters he thought he'd wiped out, drove home the reality that Germany could no longer match America's production or its spirit. The Luftwaffe pilot finally understood that for every Thunderbolt he shot down, the Americans would send 5 more. The juggernaut, once derided, was now practically inexhaustible. As the war in Europe barreled toward its end, in spring 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had completed one of the most remarkable turnarounds of any fighter aircraft in history. What began as a ridiculed heavyweight had become a linchpin of Allied victory, excelling in multiple roles. Thunderbolt pilots destroyed enemy planes in the air and on the ground in staggering numbers. According to post-war tallies, P-47s were credited with over 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in World War II, about half in the air and half on the ground, more than any other U.S. fighter. They also devastated thousands of trucks, locomotives, tanks, and gun emplacements. By one estimate, during 9 months of operations in 1944 to 45, Thunderbolts dropped over 132,000 tons of bombs and fired 59 million rounds of ammunition in Europe, an outpouring of firepower that is almost hard to fathom. Equally impressive, the P-47 ended the war with one of the lowest loss rates of any fighter, a testament to how well it protected its pilots. In total, Republic Aviation built 15,636 Thunderbolts, making it the most produced American fighter of the war. And thanks to constant improvements and the hard-won experience of its pilots, by 1945, there were few challenges the Jug could not meet. In the final days of the European Air War, P-47 pilots even tangled successfully with the vaunted German Me-262 jet fighters, shooting several of them down, usually by catching them during takeoff or landing. Truly, the dumb brute that once drew chuckles had matured into a highly lethal thoroughbred. When victory finally arrived, the men who flew the Thunderbolt were quick to sing its praises. Many firmly believed that the war would not have been won as swiftly, or with as few lives lost, without the P-47. British Air Marshal Sir William Sholto Douglas perhaps put it best when he said that the P-47, along with the RAF's Typhoon, had been the most invaluable aircraft for the close support of armies in Europe, cutting the German war machine to ribbons on the ground. General George Kenney of the USA, AF in the Pacific, credited the Thunderbolt with turning the tide in New Guinea by wresting air superiority from the Japanese and then hammering their ground units to dust. And the affection that P-47 pilots held for their aircraft remained deeply personal. Long after the war, reunions of Thunderbolt pilots echoed with toasts to the mighty Jug that had been their salvation. Some joked that the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the U.S. Air Force's tank-busting jet introduced decades later, must have been designed in the P-47's image, since it too was a bit ungainly, not very fast, but built to soak up hits and deal out devastation. Indeed, the A-10 inherited the proud name Thunderbolt as a tribute to the Jug of World War II, and it carries forward the same spirit. History can be fickle. In the public imagination, the sleek P-51 Mustang often overshadows the P-47 Thunderbolt when recalling America's World War II fighters. The Mustang was glamorous, the racehorse that stole the spotlight in the war's final act. But among those who knew the war up close, the Thunderbolt earned an almost reverential respect. It was the dependable workhorse, the heavyweight champ that took on every dirty job and delivered time and again. Pilots would often say, If I'm going to war, I want to fly a plane that can bring me back. I want to fly the Jug. In the end, the P-47's journey from underestimation to unrivaled prowess is a testament to the synergy of robust engineering, tactical adaptation, and sheer human valor. It began the war as a big joke to some, a flying milk jug that couldn't possibly dogfight. It ended the war as a nightmare to its enemies and a guardian angel to countless Allied troops on the ground. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt proved that sometimes might makes right. Its brute strength and power turned derision into astonishment on battlefields across the globe. In a war that tested the limits of courage and machines, the Jug rose to the challenge with a gutsy, unyielding performance that still echoes in the halls of military legend. From laughed at to beloved, from ridiculed to revered, the Thunderbolt's metamorphosis was complete. And as the pilots who flew it would tell you with a fond, knowing smile, the Jug earned every bit of its iconic name. It brought the thunder, and it struck like a bolt from the blue.